Welcome to the PRovoke Media Podcast. I'm Megan Miller, Head of Content Partnerships at PRovoke, and today's host of this episode. Today, we bring you the third in a series with Allison+Partners, licensed to accelerate perspectives on the future of health. In this episode, we discuss how the global pandemic has impacted both awareness and action around talent retention, recruiting, and building culture. We'll talk with CEO of Allison+Partners, Scott Allison, and Chief Human Resources Officer of Moderna, Tracey Franklin, to learn what it takes to survive today's talent wars through innovative approaches to recruiting and building culture, as well as the importance of transparency and authenticity for employers in today's environment. And I'll throw it to Scott to go ahead and introduce himself, and then to Tracey, and we can get the conversation started.
Good morning, Megan. I'm Scott Allison. I am the co-founder and CEO of Allison+Partners, a global communications firm. Started our company about 20 years ago, and we now have offices in 33 different offices in 3 different continents, and really specialize in everything from consumer technology and healthcare.
Thanks, Scott. And Tracey?
Hi, how are you? I'm Tracey Franklin. I am the Chief Human Resources Officer of Moderna. Prior to Moderna, I worked for Merck Pharmaceuticals for 15 years, but had the pleasure of working at Moderna for the last almost 2.5, 3. So I joined pre-pandemic and have been able to help to build and scale the organization at rapid speed.
So thank you both for being here. I think we will kick right off. It's really interesting to, obviously, we are both all sitting in our homes, which is particularly pertinent as we talk about culture and the changes that have come post-pandemic. But it's interesting to me why we are all here today and the connections that all 3 of us have. So through this partnership with PRovoke Media, Allison+Partners, our partner, has brought in Moderna. And I'm interested, Scott, if you could speak just a little bit about why the 3 of us in this room, why Moderna, why Allison+Partners, and we can go from there.
Great. Well, we've been very fortunate to do some work with Moderna. They've been an incredible client. They are really, if you talk about pandemic, Moderna is right there. It's such an incredible leader. And I think they were highly qualified to really speak to what's going on in the industry. We admire their approach. I think they're an incredibly entrepreneurial organization, as are we. So I think very, very appropriate to have Tracey join us.
Thank you. And Tracey, obviously forefront of the pandemic at Moderna, and interested in when your conversations around DEI, culture, talent retention, when those really started, if there was a moment that triggered it at the beginning of the pandemic, or if this has been kind of an ongoing issue or topic of interest for Moderna, really where the origins of your conversation have started.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So a bit of context. So I joined in October of 2019, so pre-pandemic. The organization that I joined was about 700 people, early stage clinical biotech, rapidly moving to late stage for a product we thought we were going to launch in 3 years. So we had no idea that the pandemic was right around the corner. But one of the things that drew me to Moderna was the culture and the ability to be your absolute authentic self. So what I found with this company was a group of really great people pointed in the same direction, trying to make the impossible possible, to which we later did, which was fun. But what had happened was, during the evolution of the pandemic, we hired so rapidly. So we had about 700 people when I joined. We're about 3,000 now. We had 55 senior leaders. We probably have 110 now. And they all came from different companies. And so in about summer of last year, Stefan and I kind of sat down and said, we have a situation here. It was almost like we had a merger integration, but a really complicated one, because we had legacy Moderna, and then a little pocket of GSK, a little pocket of Merck, a little pocket of Pfizer, and everyone was operating off of a set of behaviors and mindsets and assumptions. So it was at that point that we decided to make a concerted effort around really compiling what it was like to work at Moderna. We had our high-level values, but we got very specific around the mindsets that were needed to propel the organization forward. And through that, we had always had a focus on belonging, diversity, and inclusion, leading with belonging. So that's kind of the origin of where that culture work started.
Thanks. And Scott, for you over at Allison+Partners, imagine it has, for many of us, these have always been conversations that have been relevant to our organizations, but the pandemic just really highlighted the need for it. Where were your conversations with Moderna in this process? Were you kind of walking similar paths, or were you really interacting together as you thought through what yours would look like at Allison+Partners?
Well, I think there's an overlap in approach and culture, and as I said, entrepreneurship. But I think we were having to work parallel paths. I think obviously have a major healthcare and everything that Tracey's and Moderna were tackling, different than a PR agency. And I think we were dealing with some of the same global hiring retention issues. So certainly there's similarities there, but kind of having to march on our own path based on industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so curious, Tracey, when you talk about like the different pods or organizations that were coming together from various other organizations, were you dealing with entire teams that were coming from one sector and then another team that would come from this sector where they were individuals from the previous company were still working together, or was it just a general kind of mashup of everybody all in one space?
It was a general mashup. So we would hire the leader, because remember, we were early stage moving to late, but we didn't have capabilities to walk a product out the door globally. And so we had to literally build functions that didn't exist before. So we would hire the leader of the function, be like, welcome, come, go build your team, go build your team, go build your team, right? And so it was a rapid hiring with people from all different industries, from all different companies that came together.
And then as you've developed these mindsets, which I'm actually going to ask you about momentarily to kind of walk us through the mindsets that became your framework, were you thinking through what that meant for partners that you were working with? So somebody like Allison+Partners or other contracted consultants that you had along the way, were those mindsets, did they become relevant to the priorities that you had with other partners that you were working with?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think our ability to memorialize the mindsets has helped us to communicate when we do external partnerships around how we operate, right? So we are, a company that prioritizes urgency, moves quickly, bold, right? And so our ability to be able to crystallize that, put them on our website, but then use that as a tool when you go through an RFP or partner selection and things of that nature. So, the people who you're working with understand the way you're operating has been really beneficial to us.
Yeah. And Scott, have you seen sort of like, obviously your framework of both organizations kind of mesh together, but what is it that stands out with Moderna and then Allison+Partners on why you make such good partners for each other?
Well, I think Tracey touched upon it. They are a fast-moving organization. I mean, they are scaling really rapidly. They were doing some of the world's most important work, obviously racing against the clock to develop, a game-changing vaccine. So kind of but the similarities, I think, in approach, the kind of people we hire, strategic people, entrepreneur people that can move fast. I think that's where the mesh is. Dealing with the pandemic, I think we were in a couple different places, though. I think as Tracey, they were scaling so fast. The work was so critical and so important. The communications agency, had a different approach. I mean, and I think if you look at the pandemic, it's kind of a tale of two parts. The first part on our side, our industry got crushed in the beginning stages of the pandemic. And I think it was a big part of our culture. So a lot of companies, a lot of agencies in particular, were doing massive layoffs those first 3-4 months of the pandemic. And we made a decision that we would not lay off one person. And we never did lay off one person as we navigated that first phase of the pandemic. Tracey's experience, I'm sure, was a little bit different because they were polar opposite. They weren't in layoff mode, they were in mass scale mode. So again, we were on kind of divergent paths and each dealing with separate challenges. But the core of the kind of people I know that Moderna brings on board is very similar to the kind of people that we bring on board. And I think that's where the real similarities were.
And I think for your culture, that's so critical, right? That commitment that you made to not let one person off and actually do it had to really reinforce, the values of your company and how your culture works. So kudos for that. I think that's amazing.
Well, I think too, fortunately, unfortunately, we kind of in battle. We launched our company a week before 9/11. So I always say the first year was, a brutal downturn. And then our 20th year was a pandemic. So it kind of bookended on crises. And we put such an emphasis on taking care of people. We navigated the recession in 08, 09. And I think that becomes a hallmark of the culture is you really take care of good people. And I think folks did appreciate that approach. I mean, I used to get a lot of nervous calls saying, "Oh, just tell me, are we going to let people go?" And I'm like, I can look you in the eye on camera and promise that we are not letting anybody go. And I think that led people to focus on the work. Everybody, I think of all the working parents that were having to deal with getting kids out of school and trying to protect their own health and safety. If they didn't have to worry about their job, that was a big plus. And massively moving our global organization, 30 plus offices around the world, and trying to get everybody home and then not drop the ball for clients. And I think that was the challenge is we were dealing with this massive internal shuffle, but we had to make sure we were helping our clients too. So I always tell people I would not wish that first 4 months of the pandemic on anybody. I mean, it was a really, really tough, find a lot of high wire walking to pull it all together.
Yeah, we had interesting. I think you touched on the wellness component, and I know it's a focus for a lot of people, but it's really real, right? And for us during the pandemic, we had a little bit of the opposite. So we had to have people continue to come in and manufacture vaccine, and we had to do things like pop up, daycare centers when the states closed them down. We popped them up for our employees. We sent meals home. We did everything we could humanly possible, testing, protection, just to make sure that we were keeping people safe, as we had such dedicated people to deliver on the mission. And I think that theme, has pulled through right into how our culture and our environment works in terms of us taking care of both employees through really, unique benefits. But I think what we learned is how to extend that to families and, how do you think about the unit holistically? Because a lot of the times it's not the employee who actually needs something, it's the strained, partner at home or, elderly parent or something. And so we've got these, kind of unique solutions that we're looking at around really looking holistically at the wellness of the whole unit.
That's a great point. Yeah, and there was major issues. I mean, particularly we have a lot of working moms in the company, and we know that the childcare, the school, these were rough issues. And I remember doing calls with a lot of work, and you could just see the strain and tiredness on the face, and just trying to be as supportive as we could, and letting people. We have unlimited PTO. Letting people take that time they need for all the care that was required.
What were some of the factors that both organizations use to sort of gauge those culture needs? So, Scott, you'd kind of mentioned, the phone calls the concerned phone calls of, is my job going to be here? But when everyone's moving so fast, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, what were some of the ways that you quickly gauged needs? Were there polls, employee, town halls? What were the metrics you used?
Yeah, and it was just setting up we had to set up like a war room in our homes. Really, we moved to 8 a.m. Global board calls every single morning. We started doing, initially it was daily video programs to the company. Sometimes just 2-minute, quick outputs. Then it shifted kind of weekly, and a lot of touch points. We were doing surveys, surveys every week to see how people were feeling. And really, we started doing all the co-founders of the company, just like the old telephone tree, where we were just calling people on Teams video calls, and unannounced. We had no time to schedule calls. Literally, we were just smiling and dialing via Teams and just checking in on people and just asking them, how are you doing? How are you holding up? What do you need? And it was those touch points that I think made a real difference for us. And just working fast. We had a wonderful, our version of Tracey. We had a great head of HR who was actively engaged too in all of this, and just coming up with ideas constantly of what do we need to do to adapt on the fly, to take care of folks.
Yeah, and I think similar to us and a lot of those, so, obviously we have surveys and employee resource groups, and we use we have a voice of the employee group as well that we tapped. I think one of the unique things that happened to our company was it went from a fairly unknown or local known biotech company to a world, household name in a short period of time. And some days it was good in the news cycle. Some days it wasn't good in the news cycle. You have protesters outside, extreme left, extreme right. You had a whole bunch of situations. You had your grandmother calling you and asking you about the efficacy of a vaccine, which they never knew before. And so here we had a group of people working so hard, right, to deliver on a mission, but there was this level of attention that people didn't have before. And so we quickly realized it was always a transparent communication organization, but we sped that up and made sure that we would just, hop on town halls, explain, give people context. And I'm a firm believer, and that's why I love, Scott, your telephone calls. I'm a firm believer that you lose context over email. And there's only certain things you can put in email. And so what people really needed was to just hear, how we were thinking about things, what the backstory is, why we were making decisions. And so I think that culture of that pick up the phone, do the quick town halls, do your senior leader meetings is so critical, and one that we, have continued to move forward with.
That's such an interesting point, Tracey, that I think a lot of us probably weren't even aware of is suddenly being put in this worldwide spotlight. A burned out employee doesn't always speak the greatest of a company. And you guys were probably with our first responders and frontline workers really in the spotlight more than most organizations. That was that something that you were prepared for as you threw your hat in the ring to be developing a vaccine, or was that something that was sort of like, oh my gosh, this is hitting today, this is our new reality? Like where in the thought process was that conversation?
Yeah, it was fascinating when we had when the executive team sat around the table and talked about the participation of a vaccine in the pandemic. Once we realized that we knew we could potentially be part of the solution, we should, right? And we had to. But when you really reflect on it, it was kind of crazy, right? So we were a fairly startup company, didn't have the capability globally, wasn't sure what was going to happen with the pandemic, with competitors, with the US government. There were so many different factors. And as an exec team, we kind of locked arms and said, sure, let's try to launch our first product on a global stage. Why not? Like, what could go wrong, And so there was a series of things that we probably weren't prepared for, but luckily the culture of the company for the 10 years prior really was why we were able to be successful throughout the whole pandemic. And so I think the spotlight was certainly one that we weren't prepared for. And it was a little crazy. You had big pharma companies going out, almost speaking directly against what we were doing. And so, there'd be one good news cycle, then it would go down, then it would go back up. And we were hiring employees from those other pharma companies who are just, getting calls from their peers like, are you serious? Do you really think you can do it this quickly? And so it almost made us lock arms as a whole team together and be like, yeah, like we're totally going to do this. And then we just, like I said, prepared the organization with as much context as we could, while being conscious to not make them spokespeople of the company. So we had to be like, you're off the hook. Like listen, I couldn't go anywhere without people asking me 72 questions about the vaccine.
I can't even imagine what it was like being on your side. That's just, such a different animal.
Totally mental, right? It was mental. It was, now you look back on it, it was kind of fun, but no, none of us were prepared for it.
Well, you went from such a probably low awareness level to probably one of the most known companies in the world in such a rapid time frame. And I think that's probably never been really seen before.
Yeah. And that's why we need great partners like you guys to help us through that.
It was an honor. It was an honor.
Well, Scott, you talked about how you had 9/11 as your, launching point and framework, and even then the recession. But Tracey, did you, or I guess Scott also, as you're walking with Moderna through this, were there other case studies? I mean, nothing compares to the pandemic, but was there anything that you were using as like, oh, that might guide us a little bit, or there's a learning we can learn from this particular case study, or were there other things that you looked to kind of predict?
I mean, there are some basis, crisis communication tenets that you can fall back on. But I think this was such a unique scenario. And I think if you think of a global crisis that literally touches almost every human on Earth, you'd probably have to go back to World War II. And even I don't know if that was that inclusive. But I think if you look at the pandemic, there is not a person from the most remote corners of the earth that were not touched by this pandemic. And I think that is about as dramatic thing we've seen. I don't think there was much of a playbook for that. I don't think there's much of a playbook now for coming out of a pandemic and trying to establish, a level of normalcy. I mean, a lot of this, we're all kind of working for the same time going through it.
I think the biggest lesson that I learned was truly how important culture is, right? And how to be clear around it, how to live to it, how to hire to it, develop to it, even transition out of the company, people out of the company for it, right? Because I think if you lose yourself, and lose what makes you unique or who you are as a company, then that's not great, right? So that was kind of one thing. And you could look to big companies who scaled to reinforce those. The one other thing that I feel like I really learned though was that I almost feel like we should throw out some existing leadership books and really redo them. Like, what does it mean to be a leader? Like, how do you truly authentically lead? The people who work at Moderna are the most amazing people I've ever seen. And I think it's because they can be their authentic self, the good, the bad, the spiky, the whatever it is. And that's different, right? And the authenticity and the dynamic range that we use. And so I'm not sure the answer, and maybe one day we'll figure it out, but there's something to be said around the changing nature of leadership throughout this.
I would agree. And I think tossing the new business books are going to be needed rapidly.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it has been a dramatic shift and dramatic changes. And I think it'll be interesting to see how much stays for the long haul. I mean, what is the future of the office and workspace and things like that? It's still an unknown.
I'm very curious to talk kind of future and pivot here, but before we do so, I've had one kind of lingering question, which is one of the key tenets of leadership is that you need to, for lack of better saying, fill your own cup first, or you need to be making sure that you've also met your needs before you can give to, a lot of people who have their eyes on you. And I'm very interested to know, what was it internally that, whether it was your leadership teams or yourselves, how did you continue to find that strength to give to people in these really, really trying times? Or where did your, instinct to lead so authentically, where did that come from for both of you?
Well, I think, you have to, in times of crisis, and this is kind of the crisis play, but the most important thing is you have to be visible. And you have to really be on the front lines with people. You have to really up the communication. You have to really let people know we have a plan, we're moving forward. We care about you and your well-being, and we're going to get through this. And you have to keep reinforcing that message, but you got to be really present too. I mean, I doubled down on the visibility and making sure that, I could be reached pretty darn close to 24/7. And was available for that outreach. And I think presence is such a big part of it. You've got to be present.
I think that's absolutely right. Super important. The thing that I'll add is what I tried to do was role model a bit of relief for people, right? And so that 24/7 nature, how do you walk away from the computer? So I would do calls like walking, for example, because I needed to clear my own head. And it got to the point where you almost felt guilty, having dinner with your kids or something, right? Because everyone was where we were a tiny company, everyone was working constantly. And so to start to role model holding some like an hour over dinner sacred, or, it's okay to have lunch with your husband if you're working from home, and just communicate that openly, allowed people to do the same thing, or else you were just going to mentally fry. Like, we firmly believe, like, if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not the best version of yourself. And so we have a culture where you can do a little bit of a timeout. Like, if I don't take a break, I'm now hurting the company more than I'm helping the company. And so how do you balance that in a high paced, high stress environment? I think was also in addition to what Scott said, important for me.
Yeah, and I think Tracey brings up that good point too. And the challenge, I think, of working remote, and I think we all suffered from this, is there was really no break. There was no separation. Like, when you go to the office, you might commute into an office and then you commute out of the office. There tend to be a natural break. When we're sitting in these back rooms at our home, it was a cycle that never ended. And I think that was really draining on people. And I think, to Tracey's point, you had to reinforce, it's okay, make sure you have dinner with your family, because I think people just tended to work many, many more hours during the pandemic than normal because there was no separation. And that was a challenge. And I think we had to actually do like forced PTO. We would have to call them and say, you've got to take next week off. You just have to take that week off. You have to recharge. And, it was difficult.
Were there red flags along the way when you were noticing some of your like very in-demand employees or high profile leaders, where you were able to say, like, this person needs the break or this person needs the time? Like, what kind of checks and balances did you sort of run almost at a personal leadership level to take care of your other leaders who are in these hot seats with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a daily phone call with our head of HR, and a lot of it was spent on, hey, so-and-so in this office really is struggling, needs a break. I mean, that was the daily phone call. And then we'd figure out the outreach, and we would do things. We would send, meals to people's homes, set up meal services. We had so many pregnancies and babies born during the pandemic. And there was just all those human moments that you had to adapt to.
Yeah, similar for me. And we have something we call Moderna Month. So it's a month away from the office. And we encouraged that or triggered that with a couple of the folks that we knew needed a break. And we also sought out how to rotate people, right? So how do you rotate someone who's really high performing into a different area? We had a great woman in manufacturing who was leading a whole bunch of the COVID effort, take a bit of time and then rotate into HR. And now she's rotated back into manufacturing. And so we had a couple of those scenarios, because sometimes when you're close to burnout, you just need you need to look at the company through a different lens, or you just need a different kind of rotation or assignment. And so that's something that we did then, but that we're also, pulling through now.
So looking ahead, we've talked about what the pandemic and the peak of it felt like and what that looked like. What will you take with you and continue to apply when you're looking at talent retention, recruiting, maintaining that culture? Like, culture is going to look different than it did a year ago, and the needs of what our cultures need to look like next year are going to be different than they were this year. And what are some of the core values, the practices, the things that you intend to continue to apply? And what are some of the things that you might be exploring or using to inform what is needed next?
Those are big questions, Megan. I think a lot of the unknown as we're diving into this next chapter. Culture was not, if I can speak more to the agency side, where the human interaction was always really critical to the culture. And I think we definitely took a hit. I think we thought the pandemic was originally going to be a sprint, like we got through this for 6 months, and then it turned into a marathon, which I think was a whole different challenge, that you had to hunker down for the long haul. And culture definitely took a hit. We had a lot of people join the company who had never been to an office, who had not met people, face to face. And I think that had some difficulties. I think we also adapted, in this time of, working remote. I think everybody would say there were some good things about remote and there were some bad things about remote. And I think we're now moving into a hybrid model. Folks are actually coming back next week officially. The offices will reopen and people are going to be coming in. We're asking for at least 2 days a week. You can come in as much as you want, but at least try to come in 2 days a week. And I think people are really ready for that, as we've done surveys and talked to people where maybe a year ago they weren't as comfortable. Now people seem like, yeah, we really need to have some of that human interaction. And I do think I started doing it a few months ago, going 2 days a week, because I'm like, I'm not going to ask somebody to do something unless I want to do it first. And what I found, what was interesting, was the equilibrium you get from that. So when the night before, if I'm going into the city, the office, I'm like, oh, I'm going to the city tomorrow. That'll be kind of nice. But then also to say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to work from home. And that'll be nice too. So I think that equilibrium and flexibility and adaptability, we've learned how to adapt on the fly. And I think from even a technology aspect, we've really improved the technology. We can do things remote. If for some reason we had to go back, easy to do. So I think we know how to be flexible and kind of take some of those learning lessons. But I do believe that the human interaction at some level is really important. And I said from day one, we're not going to become a virtual company. At some point, we will be coming back at some level.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've taken it even a little bit further. So we believe in a primarily in-person culture. So we are still a fairly young organization. We scaled very quickly. There's a lot of work that we need to do cleanup, but there's also a ton of innovation that we're doing. But our landscape has changed overnight, right? And so we were primarily Massachusetts based, and now we have offices all over the world. And we're looking at 4 or 5 more hubs in the US. And so it's not a primary in person in Cambridge, although we are investing heavily in brand new buildings and things of that nature, making sure it's the right type of environment when people come back. I have not given official guidance yet around, and I don't think I will, around what that means, because I believe in flexibility too, right? And so how do you look at what's needed to be done for your company, for your team, and then what you personally, need to have accomplished in terms of flexibility in your life. So we firmly believe in that, but we do invest in facilities in the core to bring people together. And so we like to say we're running an experiment. We'll see how that goes. And it's interesting. I have gotten feedback from people, particularly newer hires, saying like, that's not what everybody else is doing. And I, kindly smile back and I say, well, we don't want to be everybody else, right? We're building something that's never existed before. And so the way that we believe we need to operate looks like this. And sometimes that's popular and sometimes it's not, but we'll certainly continue to take feedback and adjust.
And I think it's shifting rapidly too, Tracey, as I'm in the Bay Area in San Francisco and all surrounded by technology companies, and they're starting to come back quickly, and a lot of even the companies that were like, oh, we may be remote forever, they're kind of changing.
Yeah.
I think everybody's realized, particularly this last year, how important a level of human interaction is. I believe that as this thing starts to really pick up some steam, it'll snap back rather quickly. I think people will be surprised how quickly. I don't think you go back to 2019. And I've got a lot of my own folks saying, are we ever going back 5 years? I don't think so. I don't think we need to be back in the office 5 days a week. But I do think the hybrid model is going to be important. I do think people are going to be surprised how quickly it'll look more like 2019 than it looked like in 2021 is kind of what I see.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think, Tracey, you said it so well just a moment ago. We're all living an experiment right now. And I thank you both, Scott, for your predictions and your assessment. And hopefully the next time all 3 of us see each other, we will not be on Zoom and it can be in person, as we all agree that is the best. So any parting words before we sign off, Tracey, Scott?
I think the only parting words is such a, you almost lose the adjectives, what interesting times we've been through. But I think you learned a lot about human spirit, resolution, and resolve. We are we were in awe of what Moderna accomplished during this time frame. I think it was nothing short of heroic, and it was inspiring to watch that. And I think that we as an agency and our clients and what we all had to do to get through this, it was kind of an incredible challenge. And I think a challenge of a lifetime from a business standpoint, and something that we won't ever forget.
I totally agree. And I think we couldn't have done it without all of our partners, right? There are so many, you guys included, who helped us and contributed significantly around the globe to really to be able to produce a vaccine. And so we're hugely thankful for everyone's support as well.
There you have it. This has been the PRovoke Media Podcast. Thank you to Tracey Franklin of Moderna and Scott Allison of Allison+Partners, our sponsored partner of this episode. And thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracey. Take care.